don't go and assume that like nobody else is doing what you're doing, because the world's too big and there's too many products out there, and something out there is trying to address whatever problem you're trying to solve.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang. Hey, get ready. For a lot of you who are listening to this podcast and that are involved with folks who would be interested in this topic, you're going to find this really fascinating, as we're going to talk about something that I think affects everybody right now when you start looking at the slew of different products that are coming out in the market and are also failing in the market, that are also disrupting the market. I mean, all these different factors and how it affects marketing and sales, and how sometimes marketing and sales are ineffective. Because we're going to talk to Derek Osgood, and we're actually going to learn how rapid growth B2B companies actually go to market. Derek, welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jim. I'm excited to chat about this.
The same here. I mean, you and I have we've done some prep, and so while that is going to be guiding discussion points for us, I think we're going to have a good opportunity to really explore some of the things that you're going to share because of some of the research and insights that you've been able to capture for a long time. But before I go into that, can you please tell the B2B DM gang a little bit about yourself so that they can see really what we're going to get into today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the TLDR me is that I started my career early on in entertainment. So actually selling to consumers, launching big AAA games as a product manager at PlayStation. Basically, ever since, I've been in and around venture-backed startups in both, B2B and B2C. So did a bunch of early stage stuff, running marketing teams in every possible vertical you can imagine, ranging from like messaging to payments to field service management. Then did some corporate innovation stuff in BBVA's fintech arm, basically running marketing across a whole portfolio of companies that we'd either invested in or acquired, or created and incubated in-house. And then most recently, I was one of the first couple dozen folks at Rippling, running product marketing, and helped them scale up from 0 to about 20 million in ARR and got them through Series B. And they're one of the fastest growing B2B products out there these days. So learned a whole bunch of stuff about B2B marketing. And these days I'm building a platform for product marketing and product teams to collaborate around go-to-market processes that is this whole unholy amalgamation of a whole bunch of different categories of tool, but basically helps speed up time to market and create more stakeholder alignment around launching products.
Wow. I mean, as you were talking, I started thinking about, well, Derek, you kind of make it simple and you've got all these experiences in these particular areas. But then I started thinking about the vast difference between, business to consumer, the vast difference between, if I'm using channels and I'm, and have a different, source or path to the customer, the B2B elements, and the differences between a B2B solution that is more of a transactional type of product where, for example, sign up all your people for $5 a month. Well, that's a transaction, versus a complex, consultative type of sale where, maybe we have to do some customizations and we're looking at long-term relationships. We're looking at, you said alignment. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's all kinds of different alignment scenarios in all of that, isn't there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different teams, and especially when you're talking about B2B, where there's typically sales teams and customer success teams, and all of these teams need to be working in concert around any new introduction of a product, of a feature, and they need to be telling a very consistent story, because your marketing actually needs to align really, really well with the way that your sales teams and all the frontline customer-facing people are talking about your products. And so it's incredibly easy for all of that stuff to get out of sync. And especially when you're a company that's growing fast and you're launching lots of new stuff on a regular basis, and you're just introducing a ton of change to your story and to your product to customers. And so it's incredibly important. And it's one of the things that I think is consistently overlooked by, too many companies. And, the really, really good high growth companies are the ones that kind of get this. So yeah.
Well, you and I talked about high growth and what that may even mean. So, I mean, when I start thinking about business growth, it could be, maybe that startup who just maybe got, a good, round of funding. It could be that legacy business who now, because they made some right moves, either through acquisition, they have an opportunity, or a particular organization that through their being truly customer centric have actually created a solution for their customers that they really want. Again, when I start thinking about alignment and those different scenarios, it could seem quite endless. And I could see where a lot of people would say, well, what do you mean? We're just creating a product and going to market. Yeah, right.
Yeah, people love to do the build a thing and then just like put it out there and hope that it sells itself. And that just never works that way, unfortunately. Actually having a plan and actually identifying, who the right customers are, how to talk to them, and actually communicating that internally is much, much more important than we'd all like to wish that it was. Unfortunately, we all think that we can, send an email to customers and that's sufficient to get them to understand that this new thing that we just shipped is really important. But the reality is most customers need many, many different touch points to really fully digest anything that you're trying to introduce to them. And on top of that, they need a clear, consistent story that they can actually grok without, spending the number of hours that you internally are spending thinking about this thing that you're shipping. So it's really, really critical, and it's you can't mess it up. Like if you mess it up, you end up just with all of these new, whether they're product or feature or acquisition introductions, they just flop. And, you end up wasting sometimes thousands, sometimes millions of dollars that you spent on product development that, a product that is dead on arrival.
Well, as you're saying that, I would assume that a lot of people, when they're looking for answers in regards to make sure that that doesn't happen, based on the complexities that you and I just talked about, and them not being aware of that or having experiences and expertise in that, they probably start asking some pretty basic questions like, for example, hey, what channels do I need to use with all these different channels out there in order to be able to market and sell my product, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think like this is common. We hear this from people who are coming to us asking questions about, go-to-market processes all the time. And I've heard this for years as a marketer. It's like the number one question that everybody asks is external facing. They're asking like, what channel should I be using to talk about this thing? They're asking like, oh, I want to get press. How do I get press to talk about me? Or, how do I sell this thing? And, like what budget should I be allocating to all these different channels? And those are totally the wrong questions to ask, because if you get all of the internal stuff correct, you will get all that external stuff will take care of itself. Like the channels that you use almost don't matter in many cases. Like the important thing is the way that you are actually leveraging them and the way that you are communicating an effective message across them. So I think, people spend way too much time focusing externally when they really should be looking inward at both their product and company, but also at their process. So, that's it's a common problem, but everybody does it for the first few revs on this process.
Well, and as you say that, and I can understand for all of us who are trying to get something accomplished, we have to have a very effective system in order to be able to execute. But as you were saying that, I would dare to say that a lot of the data and the insights and the information are really customer types of information and data. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, people end up spending, again, this is another common pitfall, is people build a thing and they're very proud of this thing that they built. And, the product team's all excited. They're like, oh, look at this like incredibly cool new tech that we just built and launched. But the reality is people end up not spending enough time thinking about how that thing actually fits into their customers' lives. And so if you're really customer centric, first of all, hopefully you're not building things unless customers actually need and want it and it's solving a real customer problem. That's the number one cause of product launch failure. But, even if you are, oftentimes you get sucked down into this rabbit hole of thinking about the thing that you built. And again, forgetting about like how to tell that story within the context of, your customers' lives. in a way that makes it actually compelling to them, because they don't care about the fact that you built, a drill. They want an 8-inch hole. Like, so it's, I mean, that's the old maxim, but it's one that companies all too often forget.
Well, yeah. So that's what's the problem that you're actually attempting to solve, not the features and benefits that are going to solve the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, also too, I find it really interesting because I start thinking about experiences that I've gone through as you're sitting here and, talking about all of this alignment and nuance and system and process and insight and, analysis and all of that. And I've come across, and I'm sure you have too, where you'll get people that are, founders of organizations, CEOs of organizations, and in their heart and mind, they truly believe that they're so uniquely and distinctly different than everyone else that they really have no competition. Yeah. And for one, I remember a conversation I was having, and I showed him an industry competitive landscape and it had like 2,500 logos on it. And he looked at it and said, none of them are our competition. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, it's people like to believe that their thing is a special snowflake. And the reality is you probably have one, maybe two features that are truly like differentiated from the rest of the market. But I think, the other big thing that people forget is they forget to look at the market and understand that, look, if you are really solving a problem, your customers are doing something to solve that problem today. Like they are using either a competitor, or this is the area that people especially forget about when they're doing competitive analysis, or they have some alternative that isn't a product that is being sold to them. They're using something like a spreadsheet to solve for it. And so they have something that they're doing in order to do this thing. Otherwise, there's no job to be done. There's no reason for them to like hire your product. And so people like need to, if you tell me that you don't have competitors, like you don't have a product, you don't have a business. And the reality is you need to go out, figure out who those competitors are, and figure out like what about your product actually makes it uniquely better than those products. And even if it's just price, like you could say, hey, we do all the same stuff, but we're cheaper, we're faster, we're better. Find something about your product that stands out from them. But don't go and assume that like nobody else is doing what you're doing, because the world's too big and there's too many products out there, and something out there is trying to address whatever problem you're trying to solve.
Well, in addition to what you're just saying, it goes back to having that type of competitive landscape, in that all of those organizations, even if there is, well, just say only a few of them are not your competitors, because otherwise, if you looked at the entire ecosystem, 60% of your features and benefits are in that entire, so they're all going after the same ICP, right? Yep. And they're all trying to get attention. So if anything, and in today's world, I think we're probably competing more for the attention than we actually are for the sale. Oh yeah, totally. It's a noisy world now. There's so many products out there. There's so many companies trying to just, especially with the rise of how high VC investment is now, there's so many companies that are well-funded that are spending huge marketing budgets to try and capture customer attention. And so we're all competing for that. And this is especially true, like when you start looking at like content marketing and SEO, there's so much more content today than there was even a couple of years ago that it's incredibly hard to stand out. So realistically, your goal actually should be, and I think companies get afraid of competitors because they're like, oh, I want to frame this as there's no competitors because we're solving the same problem. And the reality is like competition isn't bad. What you really should be competing on is identifying like, okay, what's the other slice of the market that you can go after? Because every competitor is going to have some focus area. Like they will be better at targeting like medical technology companies, and maybe your focus area ends up being like a similar ICP where it's still, some kind of like hardware technology, but maybe you're targeting like consumer hardware technologies. And realistically, there's a big enough pie out there for you to identify like where your product fits in best and just position your product better for that audience. And the more you can make it feel tailored, the more they're going to pay attention to you in the way that they won't to a tool that's not really like, or that isn't focused in who it's paying attention to. Well, as you're saying that, I also let's just drill it back down is we're not selling to machines, we're selling to human beings, and human beings must have the ability to compare.
Yeah, exactly. Our brains are wired to make rapid decisions based off of comparison inputs that we have already formulated. Like regardless of whether or not you are creating a new category and your tool is completely different than anything else, we are going to try and frame it as humans within the context of the things that we know. And that's something that, companies try and, like, especially startups, like, they're especially guilty of this because they think that their thing is, they're pitching to investors and they have to convince investors that this thing is, the best thing since sliced bread. But they forget that customers are still going to frame it within whatever their existing paradigm of understanding is for the problem that they're solving. So you have to give people a way to compare. And then, if you can make a clear argument for why your thing is clearly better and more unique than whatever the competitive tool that you're trying to sell against is, typically you'll win that sale. So yeah.
Okay. So then we're really, and we talked about, customer, client, prospect, ICP, that we're talking about, being real, connecting with them, all of to me, I would have to start thinking that the whole behavioral science associated with go-to-market has probably become significantly more important in the past couple of years than it ever before.
Oh yeah, totally. I think marketers are consistently getting better and better at being both more data-driven these days, but also becoming better at understanding, like, real customer and user psychology. I think, back in the day, say 20 years ago, like before a lot of the internet made everything harder for marketers, easier in some ways, but also harder for marketers because of all the increased competition. It was enough to just build a really nice brand. And it was enough to say, hey, like, we're creating a lifestyle brand that, like, really resonates, emotionally with these customers. But now there's so many different small, behavioral economics tools that you need to have in your toolkit in order to get somebody to convert. And, you're starting to see this finally, like, most SaaS products are using things like price anchoring and building out pricing tiered pricing models that actually helps nudge people towards the kind of pricing plan that they really want them on. And these things took a while to catch on, but now you need to be good at understanding, all of the possible behavioral economics levers that you have available to you in order to get somebody to close a sale.
Okay, so now for us and a lot of our listeners, we're really focusing in on, high ticket, very, very complex, B2B sales that are, require also one particular element that we haven't had talked about yet, but I think is critically important if we start talking about, go to market and all that, is the interactions that our, salespeople are having with our prospects, and then the relationship that ultimately we hope, results in the sale. And so if you start thinking about that from a go-to-market strategy perspective, because I've had this conversation with a couple of folks, that doesn't come into consideration until very, very late, if at all. How are you addressing that particular issue to say, okay, from an alignment perspective, we have to make sure that all these things are hitting, because once we become incongruent or there's a disconnect with customers in their mind, and we haven't gotten to the point of having trust, we're going to lose them and our conversions are going to die. How are you actually addressing that and managing that?
Yeah. So, I think, like, the longer sales cycle process is something that mostly it comes down to just being really, really clear across your organization on what are the product milestones in terms of getting that product to market that you're going to hit, and making sure that everybody is consistently aware of exactly whether or not you are on track to hit those or not. Because one of the big problems that teams often run into is, like, the sales team is trying to sell against a customer need, and the customer's asking for a feature, and the sales team wants to press that thing, and they want to say, hey, like, we are building this thing, it's going to be in your account in a month. And that's not really the way that product stuff works, where, it's hard to estimate and things shift and they change timelines. And the second that customer starts getting a whiff of like, you are over promising on your roadmap and you are missing consistently the dates that you're telling them something's going to be live, you start just breaching trust with the customer. And so, I think what we're trying to do is, first of all, like, get everybody on the same page about what's shipping when, so that they don't get blindsided by that stuff. And the sales team can give accurate estimations to customers around when and how things are going to be hitting their account. But I think, the other big thing which you touched on is you do need to have a really clear buyer journey mapped out. And so your sales team knows exactly what process they are following, and then when are handoffs happening to customer success? Like when does the sales process end and the onboarding process begin with implementation? When do customer success teams come in and start trying to cross-sell? Who is responsible for cross-selling different products? So for example, oftentimes the sales team thinks that it's their job to cross-sell, but maybe the customer success team is better equipped to do that because they're working directly with that customer on a day-to-day basis on all their support needs, and they can insert those cross-sell opportunities in a more organic fashion. So I think so many companies like never map that journey out, and they never really understand, okay, and this is especially true when you have multiple buyers too. So many companies are selling to a buyer that their initial contact is in one department, but then there's 5 other stakeholders across different teams, and they don't really have a clear picture of like, how do we navigate from the first of those people to the 5th person when we need all of them to sign off in order to close the deal. And so, they end up kind of flailing, and sales die in that process because they're trying to figure it out on the fly.
Well, and so as you were answering a question, and I think you and I had talked about before, is when people come to you and they ask, well, how do I get my sales process to convert faster? Or how do I get my sales process to convert better? And it's like what you just said, you got to understand all of these different points and parts of the buyer journey. By the way, for everyone, with COVID, that changed because buyer teams got bigger. They're now all remote, and all these different factors start coming into play. So you may have had a buyer journey prior to that, but if you haven't redone it since then, you're probably sailing in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you just have to be way more intentional. I mean, you have to be way more intentional. And, I think everybody is in such a hurry to get everything to convert faster right away that they don't realize that you kind of have to go slow to go fast. Like, you have to actually pump the brakes a little bit. And this is true, once you are even in the selling process, you don't want your sales team spending time on accounts that aren't realistically, within your ICP. There's so many teams that are just like spray and pray. And they're like, I'm going to talk to everybody and I'm going to try and expend the same amount of effort and energy on every single sales process, when the more you can qualify, the more you can remove people from your funnel that aren't realistically going to convert, the more you can spend your focus on being intentional about building out your buyer journeys and being intentional about actually executing on those buyer journeys with the companies that are realistically going to move the needle for you.
Well, and as you're talking, I started thinking about so many of the traps associated with companies that have probably had a good go-to-market strategy in regards to fixing those problems. Like, a lot of these technology solutions that will say they will automate the marketing and sales process so that you can do that. And yet the conversions don't happen, is because it's the disconnect between, you can't automate human beings, right?
Yeah.
Right. So while you can be supported with a technology that can help you to, have the touch points, understand the journey. As somebody who was saying, I think right now, when you start thinking about, that sales cycle and buyer journey, that it takes, 21 plus touch points only to be considered.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
scary.
crazy. I mean, it's like weird that people need to be told something multiple times in order to be able to understand that they need it and want it, and they need to feel trust built over time. And, that comes not from just a bunch of like spammy email campaigns that they're getting hit with. Like, you need to have human interaction. People need to like see that there's a person behind the product that they're being sold. in part because then they feel a lot more confident that if things go wrong, they have a person who will be able to go to bat for them, like within the company. So it's it's hard to automate everything. I think, there's certain components of the like technical aspect to selling, like for example, just being able to send outbound email at scale that are starting to get automated well, but you can't, do away with the sales process and actually navigating matrixed organizations where you need, to get multiple buyers who are human to sign off on things.
Hey, all we have to do is just sign them all up for our newsletter, right?
Yeah, exactly. Once they're on the newsletter, they'll convert at some point. Don't worry about it.
I can't. I mean, when I started thinking about all of these things that you probably are running into, and even so much so, I probably dare to say you probably could have even found yourself working with a particular organization. You collaborated and you put together a decent system, and then you may come back to and say, "How did you guys muck it up this bad?"
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, we run into that ourselves. Like our sales process breaks down when we're talking to people because, we just like forget a step, or, the customer ends up not quite fitting the like buyer journey that we had outlined before. And we don't really have a plan in place for adapting to that specific new use case. So it's easy to mess it up, even if you have a process. But the more you can have thought through these potential different like curveballs that you're going to get, the better prepared you're going to be to not actually muck it up when they do arise.
Well, I think that's a also thing to understand is that we all have a system that we're using, but default is never a good one. Yeah,
exactly. And like people rely on these just like baseline templates that they found on the internet that like don't adapt at all to their exact process. They don't adapt at all to, the characteristics of their product, whether that's budget or price or, what have you. And it just doesn't work that way. Like you can't use a cookie cutter approach that's one size fits all to everything that you do. You really need to actually think through, again, like the strategy that drives your process.
Well, and talking about budget, I would dare to, you get that question a lot is, hey, how much is it going to cost me to bring my product to market, right?
Yep. A lot more than you think.
Well, okay. So help me understand that. So if I start thinking about a lot more than you think, and we talked about those differences of, B2C, B2B, B2C, B2B transactional, B2B high ticket. I mean, what kind of variance are we talking about? We can just stay in B2B. What kind of variance are we talking about in regards to, what could this investment actually entail?
Yeah, well, so I think the way that people think about costs when they're thinking about go-to-market processes is oftentimes program spend. So they're thinking about the actual like money that they are spending in advertising or money that they are investing directly into like buying event placement or that kind of thing. So it's basically the tactical activity that they're doing. But the reality is there is a lot of underlying costs that's involved in the things that we think of as like free. So a lot of people, think that they're investing. They're like, oh, we're just going to go invest in content. We're going to spend, we're going to write a bunch of articles and like, we're going to go SEO ourselves. Or, they're like, oh, we're going to do a lot of like outbound email. And we're basically just going to like go have a sales process where we directly reach out to people. But what they don't realize is there's like massive human capital involved in those processes. When you are doing content marketing, that is not free. You are spending the equivalent of probably 1 or 2 full-time people, which could be way more expensive than an alternative, advertising channel. So people don't factor in the costs they're spending at the human capital level. So they're kind of shocked when they realize down the road that like this product that they launched that ends up, converting, and I'm going to use an arbitrary number here, but like, this product that drives $100,000 in revenue ends up being a massive loss for the company because they spent, tens of thousands of dollars of engineering time. They spent tens of thousands of dollars of product time. They spent tens of thousands of dollars of salespeople's time. They spent, tens of thousands of dollars of the content person who's driving the content strategy around it. So I think, the cost there ends up being very large. And I think where teams I think B2B teams, especially, like, largely a lot of what they're doing ends up being kind of hand-to-hand combat. They're doing a lot of like cold outbound and, driving a real sales process. So the cost comes mostly in the form of like sales commissions. And, you're happy to pay a sales commission when you're closing deals because it's just a percentage of revenue. So that's fine. But you need to factor in the amount of money and time that you're spending to get to that initial close. And so, you need to bake that into your cost calculations. But, I think when you're talking about, external promotion and advertising, if you want a truly kind of breakthrough product these days, you do need to be using multiple channels. You do need to be, you need to be leaning into not just like this hand-to-hand cold outbound, but then also you probably need to be investing in content. You probably need to be investing it because you need to educate people. You probably need to be investing in some kind of top level awareness advertising so that people actually understand that your thing exists before your sales team goes and reaches out to those people. So, you're probably going to want to be doing some degree of advertising, whether that's on, LinkedIn or Facebook, or Facebook, a little bit less for larger organizations, but or whether that's investing in search advertising. So there's a lot of channels that you probably should be leveraging that you're likely not, and you're kind of just relying on your sales team to go out and do the hard work without any, over the top support from marketing.
As you're talking, though, I start thinking, going back to a word that we used and we've talked about, and that's, the whole alignment piece. Mm-hmm. Because I have seen, organizations make the mistake where they do think that the entire digital element of selling, is mm-hmm. going to essentially drive all of their sales. And then when it doesn't come, they can't understand why. Yep. And then I've also seen other organizations that sit there and state that, well, we use digital, and we don't have any salespeople per se. And I'm like, yeah, but look what you're selling. Look how you're doing it. Look what your product is. It goes back to that fit. I often find where people, because of the glamour associated with it, hey, we can do all this social stuff like you were saying, and then therefore we'll be able to meet our forecasted sales numbers, and it never happens. Never happens.
Yeah. I think a lot of this comes down to companies don't do a good job of aligning their go-to-market process with their price point. So, companies forget that, hey, you probably can't afford to have an inside sales team unless your ACV is upwards of $10,000. And you probably can't afford to have an enterprise sales team that's going to spend, 12-month sales cycles closing a deal unless your ACV is, well upwards of $100,000. So, people for kind of just, they think like, oh, we're just going to do what this other company does because they think that company's growing fast. But the reality is that company is doing what they're doing because it aligns well with their business model. And so, I think realistically, you need to use all of the channels all at once. Like, it's not, everybody always asks like, okay, what's the magic bullet like channel that I can use? Like, what's the secret that, this company over here is using in order to grow as fast as they are? And it's never one channel. It's always a confluence of multiple different channels. Like when I was at Rippling, we had outbound email. If you looked at just last touch attribution, accounted for most of our customer acquisition, but we were also spending huge amounts of money on billboard advertising on top of that. So people were becoming aware of us before our sales emails ever even hit them. And then even if they were in a sales process, they would be walking down the street and see a billboard and they'd say, oh, okay, wow, that company seems like they may be important. Maybe I should actually pay more attention to the sales process that I've been kind of dropped in the funnel on. And so I think, it's important to realize that like humans don't operate in the way that we want marketing funnels to operate. As you said earlier, it takes like 21 touches to get somebody to convert to just even being in consideration of a product. So you need to you feel like you're everywhere to them, because it makes you feel more important and it makes you feel more worth their time and worth their energy to think about.
Wow. A whole lot of additional questions that need to be asked, and very unique answers that are really needed. And so therefore, to me, it goes back to the whole, skill and expertise and knowledge and unknowing. And so if I start even thinking about, the whole go-to-market landscape, the creative and innovation type of engine. Heck, even when you start talking about certain, products, you start getting into, crowdsourcing and funding. I mean, it's just a vast array. So if you start looking at companies and organizations that can benefit the most, from the work that you are working on, and you even talk about, your systems and your platforms, where do you kind of see a sweet spot or an ICP?
Yeah. So for us, like Realista, we like to insert ourselves when companies are kind of first establishing, the early versions of their go-to-market process and like figuring out how they're going to launch products. So our ICP tends to be companies that are kind of in the 75 person to 500 person range, because that's just the point at which they're starting to build this process out. Ideally, they have a sales team, because, again, like stakeholder alignment just becomes infinitely more important when you have sales, when you have customer success, who are actually talking to customers on a fairly regular basis, because there's so much opportunity for them to, misrepresent the product that you're shipping, if they don't know what's actually coming. We tend to look, primarily at SaaS companies, but we also serve a bunch of different, verticals like entertainment, hardware, CPG. So, our market, is luckily kind of broad, just in the sense that so many different companies are launching things on a regular basis. So there's, launches across all sorts of different verticals and industries, which we support. But, we try and look at companies that are kind of in that, starting to enter growth phase and starting to feel the pain of cross-functional stakeholder alignment really breaking down in communicating launch plans. And, they may have they're starting to build out a product marketing function. And we typically sell to product marketing teams, as well as product teams, but they're starting to build out a product marketing function, and that team is probably drowning a little bit because there's so much to do. And, they really need some support. So that tends to be who we feel like we fit best with.
Well, because as you're talking, the whole cross-functional aspects of, that in itself is immense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have 8 to 10 different teams that are involved in any given launch process. The product marketing team is responsible for actually coordinating across all of those. Each of those teams needs a slightly different subset of information from the go-to-market plan. So, you can build a great go-to-market plan, but if it's one giant doc I've seen docs that people have shared with me that are 80 slides long, and your sales team's not going to go read 80 slides about this new product that you're shipping. So they need to be able to slice and dice that information and get it to teams in the format and at the level of, fidelity that those teams need. So what we're doing is we're making it really easy for you to build go-to-market plans, but then communicate those plans to people directly in their inbox, directly in their Slack, that include just the information that specific kind of user needs at that given point. So, yeah, it's massively complex. You also need just so much integration into all the different cross-functional tools the teams are using. We have to plug into the stack that the product team is using to track all the engineering work to understand what's getting built. We need to plug into, the project management tools that the marketing team is using to manage all the campaign building. And then we need to plug into the places that actually sales and support teams live to be able to push that information to them so that they don't need to go chase it, from this central tool. So it's complex, but a important problem to solve in our opinion.
Well, to me, I guess you'd say there's greater opportunity for organizations to launch products than there's ever been before. And that in itself inherently creates the market opportunity, right?
Yep. Yeah, totally. I mean, and like the companies that launch stuff more frequently and more effectively, they grow way faster than others. I mean, there's a bunch of Bain research out there that companies that, are better at launching things grow twice as fast as others. McKinsey says that 25% of all revenue in most companies is accounted for by new product introductions. And then we've seen research in a recent product marketing alliance study that basically said that companies in the top quartile of growth rate, they are 4 times more likely to treat their go-to-market process as a really critical business function than the companies that are in the bottom quartile of growth rate. So,
well, as you're saying that, from my consumer thinking and mindset, you always hear the stories about, for example, Campbell's Soup having 100 soups on the shelf and having so much in sales, and that when they reduced the number by 75%, their sales went up because they gave people less choice. So if I start thinking about that from a product marketing and a product launch and a go-to-market strategy perspective, is there also situations and scenarios where it's like, okay, you need to take these 2 or 3 products off, the list that you're selling, and this is what needs to go in its place?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately that comes down to packaging, and that's why having a go-to-market process in place is important, is because you need to be able to identify which things do you want to draw customer focus to. So you should still be shipping the features and products that you're thinking about shipping, because probably those new things that you're adding are solving very specific, real customer problems that you need, to address with your product. But I think so many companies that are, not very good at this stuff, what they do is they just ship everything and they announce everything, and they just kind of slap it on the website, and they're like, okay, this new feature also exists. And rather than actually think about having a real planning process where they can identify where those things fit into the existing paradigm of the product and frame it to customers as, maybe it's a part of another product, as opposed to being a net new feature that you're going to talk about independently. Or maybe you're rolling announcements together because there's multiple things that are shipping that all make sense together as kind of a bundled product or announcement. So definitely, I mean, I think there's addition by subtraction all over the place in this process if you're doing it well.
Okay, Derek. So I'm sitting here. I'm a B2B digital marketer. I'm thinking about the whole high ticket selling, type of solution. And I want to make sure that I am going to get the sales conversions, because marketing is getting more and more pressure to, hey, it's just not about brand building. You got to convert, right? Mm-hmm. What should I be thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that you should be thinking about, it ends up being positioning. You need to just get really, really good at understanding who your competitive set is, understanding who your customer is, understanding where your product fits into their existing frame of reference, and being way more rigorous than you think that you need to be about identifying, a real ICP. Don't go after everybody. Go after a very, very specific user with a very specific problem that your problem is uniquely suited to solve, or your product is uniquely suited to solve. And so I think and this is me biased as a product marketer, but I think it all just comes back to positioning in 99% of cases. Don't worry so much about the channels, worry about the story that you're telling. And if you're telling an effective story, then any channels you use should work pretty well.
Derek Osgood, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. How does the B2B DM gang get in touch with you?
Yeah, so if you want to get in touch, our website is haveignition.com. And then my email is derek@haveignition.com, and always love to hear from folks.
Derek Osgood, thank you for sharing that knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Jim.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.